expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Almost 40 years later, and this still holds true. When we hear the word colonialism, some may associate it with an outdated system of exploitation and coercion, one that took place a long time ago, and although it was wrong, we grew past it and learned from our mistakes. But unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that, although you may believe that this depravity is ancient history, it's not. It's just advanced with the times. Instead of subjugation by way of guns, whips, chains, and soldiers, the imperial forces of today use something that seems a little cleaner, a little more professional. They use debt. Instead of colonialism, we've moved to a system of neocolonialism. Some of the many antagonists responsible for condemning the developing world to a cycle of debt and exploitation are none other than our international financial institutions, specifically the IMF and the World Bank. So how did we get here? The IMF and the World Bank were established after the Great Depression and the Second World War to maintain global financial and economic stability. Although the war helped stimulate the global economy due to wartime production and expenditures, there was a concern that the world would revert back to the economic policies that exacerbated the Great Depression. Since slipping back into economic turmoil was such a genuine worry at the time, 44 nations sent a total of 730 delegates to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for a conference dealing with world monetary and financial policy. This gathering is known simply as the Bretton Woods Conference. Out of this conference came the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. The purpose of the IMF was to promote international monetary cooperation and ensure financial stability by stabilizing exchange rates, promoting economic policies, offering financial support or loans to member countries, facilitating trade, and so on. It's important to keep in mind that at the time, the US dollar was backed by gold and other countries' currencies were fixed to the US dollar, so having an organization, like the IMF, mandated with monitoring exchange rates and lending monies to countries who may be facing balance of payment issues made sense. However, since this system ended in the early 70s with the abandonment of the gold standard, you would think that the role of the IMF would shrink or disappear completely, but no. From 1970 to 1975, the volume of lending more than doubled in real terms, and the IMF's influence persists to this day. The IMF, like the World Bank, is not actually a bank, but it nonetheless lends money. We'll get into why this is detrimental in a bit. The way the IMF is set up is as follows. Member countries pay a quota, which is essentially a subscription. The wealthier a country is, the more money they contribute to the IMF. The more money they contribute to the IMF, the more of the vote share they have. This weighted system leads to disparities in the vote share and allows for rich Western countries to exercise political influence and power over poorer nations. They can champion policies that benefit rich Western interests at the expense of developing countries who have little to no say in the matter. To illustrate the absurdity of this system, a country like Ethiopia, with a population of 70 million, has half the vote share of Luxembourg, which has a population of only 500,000. And for years, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa had only 4.6% of the votes in the fund. This weighted voting system, predicated on wealth over population size, gives the US alone, and any 4 other G7 members acting together without the US, the ability to block policy decisions and exercise their power over developing nations. It doesn't help that the head of the IMF is always a European and the head of the World Bank is always an American. I hope you can see where this is going. Let's take a quick look at the World Bank. Like the IMF, it was created during the Bretton Woods Conference. While the two institutions are often seen as siblings, the World Bank focuses more on funding development projects and reconstruction around the world. Both institutions lend money, but they do so in a predatory way. Through the use of debt, they keep poor nations trapped in cyclical poverty, and they enable wealthy countries to exert political influence over them. This system undermines the sovereignty and prosperity of these developing nations, all while the institutions responsible for this mess claim to be motivated by the goal of spreading wealth and development. Here's how it works. During the Cold War, when the struggle for political influence and global hegemony between the West and its allies and the Soviets and their allies transpired, Western banks and institutions encouraged developing countries to take out massive loans. This process was often predatory and extremely irresponsible. These developing nations would be told that they needed IMF and World Bank loans to modernize, and debt was framed as a necessary tool for development. The IMF and the World Bank often ended up loaning money to corrupt leaders and dictators who appropriated the funds for personal use and left their country in debt. Whenever they successfully convinced a developing nation to take out a loan with them, conditionalities were part and parcel of the deal. Meaning, if a developing country took out a loan with the IMF or the World Bank, that country needed to adopt specific policy prescriptions. Those policy prescriptions were designed not to aid the developing country and turn it into an economically sufficient nation, but to prioritize its ability to repay its debt with interest and open up its economy to the West. I should note that if a country was severely impoverished, the IMF would impose either a low interest rate or no interest at all, but don't let this fool you. The intentions here were not altruistic. Interest or not, the goal was to entrap indebted countries and use them to pursue the interests of the West. To quote John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, whose job for years was to try and get developing countries to take out these predatory loans, I would work to bankrupt the countries that received those loans, after they had paid Maine and other US contractors, of course, so that they would be forever beholden to their creditors, and so they would present easy targets when we needed favors, including military bases, UN votes, or access to oil and other natural resources. Now let's get back to those loan conditionalities. The IMF and the World Bank forced borrowing countries to adhere to a set of economic reforms and policy prescriptions known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. SAPs fit snugly within the neoliberal era, and they forced borrowing countries to implement privatization of state-owned enterprises, trade liberalization through the removal of tariffs, subsidies, and so forth, deregulation, currency devaluation, and austerity in the form of cuts to public services, healthcare, education, etc. The goal was to get these indebted nations to repay their debts with interest at the expense of their impoverished populations. We'll get into specific examples in a bit. The IMF and the World Bank came to adopt what is referred to as the Washington Consensus of neoliberal growth strategies. If you don't know what neoliberalism means, I like to use David Harvey's definition, which goes like this. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. If markets do not exist in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, or environmental pollution, then they must be created by state action if necessary. But beyond these tasks, the state should not venture. Deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common. Put very simply and charitably, neoliberalism is the idea that free markets, privatization, and minimal government intervention after the state intervenes to create and prop up markets, of course, causes economic growth and prosperity. However, a critic of the theory such as myself would argue that neoliberalism increases inequality, guts the public services that help so many people, and prioritizes the rich and powerful at the expense of everyone else, as we will see later in this video. Not to mention, Western interests often impose neoliberal policies on developing countries under the pretense of fostering prosperity, but wealthy Western nations did not achieve their own economic success by following such policies. In fact, they often did the exact opposite. To quickly summarize before we go any further, what I've told you so far is a story of international financial institutions operating at the behest of rich Western interests that prey on underdeveloped nations by convincing and sometimes forcing them to take out massive loans that come with neoliberal strings attached that ultimately transform these indebted developing countries into neocolonial outposts whose sole purpose in the eyes of the Western world is to service their debt, be perpetually beholden to their creditors, and serve as cheap labor and exporting hubs for the imperial core. If any of what I just said sounds hyperbolic, let's look at the example of Somalia and how these international financial institutions decimated it to the point of complete economic collapse. Somalia is just one of the many countries that fell victim to the predation of the IMF and the World Bank. Throughout the Cold War, Somalia had been the recipient of Western loans and aid, and by the time the early 80s came around, it found itself with debt that it couldn't pay off. The IMF and the World Bank then subjected Somalia to neoliberal structural adjustment programs so they could more effectively service their debt. Prior to the IMF and World Bank's intervention, Somalia was in a much better position. To quote Mikhail Chossudovsky's The Globalization of Poverty, Somalia was a pastoral economy, meaning an economy where livestock farming is central. Based on exchange between nomadic herdsmen and small agriculturalists, nomadic pastoralists accounted for 50% of the population. Despite recurrent droughts, Somalia remained virtually self-sufficient in food until the 70s. The IMF World Bank intervention in the early 1980s contributed to exacerbating the crisis of Somali agriculture. The economic reforms undermined the fragile exchange relationship between the nomadic economy and the sedentary economy. A very tight austerity program was imposed on the government, largely to release the funds required to service Somalia's debt. Put simply, the IMF and the World Bank intervened in Somalia to restructure its governance in a way that would prioritize its ability to pay off its debt and further enrich Western nations. The policies imposed upon Somalia were the typical neoliberal ones I mentioned earlier: cuts to public spending, currency devaluation, trade liberalization, and privatization. Here's how those policies looked in action. By forcing Somalia to open up its economy to foreign imports as part of the IMF World Bank trade liberalization stipulation, foreign grain in the form of either food aid or cheap grain imports flooded Somalia. You would think this sounds like a nice thing, a bunch of free or really cheap food given to a country. How could that possibly be harmful? Well, it ended up displacing local farmers and local grain markets. The cheap grain imports and food aid undercut local grain producers and ultimately destroyed Somalia's ability to produce grain for itself. Why would people purchase grain locally when they could take advantage of the cheap grain imports flooding their country? This is noteworthy because, as I mentioned earlier, Somalia was virtually food self-sufficient prior to the IMF and World Bank meddling. Side note: remember how I mentioned that rich Western countries didn't use neoliberal policies to build their own wealth? Well, the cheap grain imports and food aid that flooded Somalia, ultimately destroying its ability to produce its own grain, came from Western governments that subsidized their own agricultural sectors to create a surplus. Meanwhile, the IMF forced the Somali government to cut spending and subsidies in its agricultural sector. The Somali government was pressured to reduce spending on veterinary care, infrastructure, and food subsidies, leaving herders and farmers without the support they needed to keep their livestock healthy. Livestock was very important to Somalia. Remember how I said it was a pastoral economy? In fact, up until the early 80s, livestock contributed to 80% of Somali export earnings. Once these public spending cuts were enacted, the government also had to cut spending on healthcare and education. The money they saved in these areas went to servicing their debts, but these spending cuts negatively impacted the Somali population, who no longer had access to government programs that had been so beneficial. As a consequence of the trade liberalization policy, Somalia was made completely dependent on the West, therefore making it easier for Western nations to exert political influence over Somalia. The US and other rich countries, by subsidizing their own agricultural sectors to create a surplus of grain, dumping that surplus into developing countries to artificially lower their prices and eventually destroy their grain markets, would force these developing nations into a position where they had to keep importing more grain from the rich Western countries, expanding Western agribusiness and funneling more wealth away from poorer nations in the developing world. In 1981, the IMF forced Somalia to reduce the value of its currency, the Somali shilling. This, combined with public spending cuts, made everything more expensive, especially fuel, fertilizer, and farming supplies. As a result, farmers struggled. They could no longer import the now unaffordable goods they needed to keep their livestock healthy. The average Somali had less purchasing power to buy food and essentials, and roads and infrastructure started falling apart because the materials needed for upkeep became unaffordable. Currency devaluation was a very common SAP policy. Although it made life harder for the people of Somalia or any other country subjected to it, currency devaluation made exports more appealing on the world stage. It also made Somali labor cheaper for foreign corporations and their powerful currencies. Remember how I just went on a massive diatribe about how Western imports of surplus grain strategically decimated Somalia's ability to produce food for itself? Well, that was only part of the plan. The other part was to turn Somalia and many other countries like it into exporting hubs for raw materials. Since Somalia's currency was devalued so low in comparison to the US dollar and other powerful currencies, they couldn't import much because it was too expensive for them. They couldn't produce grain for themselves either because of the imports that ruined their grain markets, so they had to focus on exporting raw materials to earn revenue. Somalia was forced to focus on exporting so-called high-value-added fruits, vegetables, oilseeds, cotton, and other raw materials instead of producing food for their local population. Since the Somali shilling was devalued, it became very cheap for Western countries with their powerful currencies to purchase these Somali raw materials. By 1989, debt servicing obligations represented almost 200% of export earnings, meaning even with the revenue Somalia was earning from exporting their raw materials, it still wasn't enough to service their debts, let alone enrich the country. This pattern played out in many countries subjected to structural adjustment programs. Poorer nations were forced to export raw materials to wealthier countries, which then used those raw materials for production. However, because structural adjustments stripped these poorer nations of their ability to develop domestic industries, they were unable to manufacture goods for themselves. As a result, they had to buy back finished products from the rich countries, often at significantly higher prices than what they had originally earned from exporting the raw materials. This exploitative dynamic is known as unequal exchange. In addition to everything I've mentioned so far, privatization campaigns were introduced. State-owned sectors, including agricultural and banking services, were privatized. They were sold off to private investors, which often benefited foreign corporations and Somali elites, while the rest of the Somali population was left to suffer. These privatizations made it so that foreign private interests could benefit from the revenues generated by sectors that were previously owned by the Somali government. So at this point, you might be asking, why did the IMF and World Bank impose these SAPs onto these countries when they clearly didn't work, when they clearly didn't help the people of Somalia or Sudan or Haiti or the multitude of other countries that were sacrificed in the name of neocolonialism? And the answer to that question is, they did work. The SAPs benefited exactly who they were intended to benefit, like foreign corporations and investors who gained access to cheap labor and exports due to the privatization campaigns and the opening up of the Somali economy, and Western governments, the IMF and the World Bank, who gained political influence over the country and benefited from loan repayments. Although these SAPs were implemented under the promise of development or whatever the fuck, they came at the expense of the Somali people. Somalia, once food self-sufficient, experienced a devastating famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Instead of fostering growth, the debt that was supposed to aid Somalia only further enriched the developed world and the international financial institutions that issued the loans, while Somalia's people suffered. These debts and foreign influence in the country eventually helped lead to a full-on economic collapse in Somalia. I focused on Somalia for this video, but this process was replicated all throughout the developing world. Debt was used to hook these poor countries in, and the structural adjustment program served to exploit them for all they had. SAPs also pose a significant threat to the healthcare systems of the affected countries, and women and children seem to bear the brunt of the suffering. To quote an article about structural adjustment programs published in the journal Public Health Reviews, policies adopted in adherence with structural adjustment programs frequently bear consequences for the functioning of health systems, with implications for child and maternal outcomes. Governments may be under explicit or implicit pressure to cut social spending in order to meet fiscal targets, thereby reducing the fiscal space in which healthcare systems can operate. In conclusion, the exploitation and plunder that devastated the developing world during the days of colonialism has not been eradicated. It's just been reorganized. I'll close this video out with an excerpt from one of my favorite authors, the late David Graeber. For almost 2 years, I had lived in the highlands of Madagascar. Shortly before I arrived, there had been an outbreak of malaria. It was a particularly violent outbreak because malaria had been wiped out in highland Madagascar many years before, so that after a couple of generations, most people had lost their immunity. The problem was, it took money to maintain the mosquito eradication program since there had to be periodic tests to make sure mosquitoes weren't starting to breed again, and spraying campaigns if it was discovered that they were. Not a lot of money, but owing to IMF-imposed austerity programs, the government had to cut the monitoring program. 10,000 people died. I met young mothers grieving for lost children. One might think that it would be hard to make a case that the loss of 10,000 human lives is really justified in order to ensure that Citibank wouldn't have to cut its losses on one irresponsible loan that wasn't particularly important to its balance sheet anyway. If history shows anything, it's that there's no better way to justify relations founded on violence, to make such relations seem moral, than by reframing them in the language of debt. Above all, because it immediately makes it seem that it's the victim who's doing something wrong.